My name is Fiona Smyth, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm a settler born in Teotihuacan, but living and working in Toronto. And I'm a grad from OCAD, before it was OCAD, when it was OCA. And I studied printmaking and experimental painting. And once I left school, I made a name for myself through painting in clubs and showing in galleries and making zines to sell at those shows. And the whole time I was making comics. And then later got involved with illustration and continued my art practice, and eventually started teaching comics at OCAD U. So there's a few ways I approach my work. There's also, various things that I do. So, if I'm working on my personal work, usually there's a lot of prep and drawing and dreaming and just coming up with ideas, keeping sketchbooks, just freely associating, not like being super concrete, unless I've applied for a grant, and then I have to like focus, and then working on a grant, there'll be a creative process, research time for that, but with very tight constraints. But then there's when I work on comics, if it's for a publication, then there might be sharing sketches beforehand and then creating the work. But again, if I was doing my own personal comics, it might be a stream of consciousness kind of approach, one image leading to another, and then creating a narrative from that work. And then a big part of my practice in the last 10 years has been my collaboration with sex educator Cory Silverberg on these sex ed books for kids. So, that involves a lot of back and forth with Cory, and then with an extended readership that Cory enlists to work on the books, or to read the books and give feedback. So that includes professionals in like doctors, nurses, doulas, teachers, activists, parents, guardians, kids. And in the end, there's usually 3 or 4 versions of the books before the final book. And in our most recent 2 books of that series, so there was What Makes a Baby, then Sex is a Funny Word, and the most recent one is Unisex. And Unisex is like a graphic novel. So my involvement isn't just as an illustrator or cartoonist, but actually kind of adding to the text, and not so much the sex ed part, but like the character-driven narratives within the book. The work that I do it has always been about identity and empowerment, and in recent years, understanding that relates to social justice, and especially the work with Cory, right? But as an emerging artist, my work was feminist and labeled feminist before I really understood what that meant, and I would shy away from the F word, and in those early days, and I'm talking like over 30 years ago, and then maybe 10 years into my career, or less than that, I would you know, embrace the F word and call myself a feminist artist. And, you know, in recent years, there's been a kind of a rejection of that word again, which I understand because there's maybe preconceptions of what it means and what it meant when it wasn't intersectional. So I feel like, again, I have to sort of say, yes, this work is feminist and push that. And the work in the show is all related to those intents of like rejecting a patriarchal world and creating this female peopled, non-binary, trans folks, intersex folks world. Yeah, so it's exciting to see it again and to be shared with a new audience. And you know, I always plan to turn it into, especially the Chimera's Daughters, to turn it into a graphic novel. So eventually that will happen, knock on wood. So I hope that my work is exploring empowerment. And, you know, I'm often thinking of the body, especially female body, and how it's always being pummeled by exterior forces and internalized negativity or you know, prejudices, and trying to rid the body of that, showing the body affected by that, but ridding it of that, and also discussions around or depicting how memory in the body, traumatic memory, how it's revealed by the body. So in creating these images, on a selfish tip, it's empowering myself, but hopefully by extension, folks will relate to that, like I said earlier, like this rejection of patriarchy. And I was raised Roman Catholic, so especially my earlier work was always this twisting of the power imagery that's in the church. And like, instead of showing Christ on a cross, I would show a Cupid doll or a sexy girl on a cross, which, you know, after being an artist for so many years, that feels like that's emerging artists, especially woman artists, go through a phase where they take that kind of sexualized imagery and subvert it. The drawing siphon was a drawing project that was that I got grant funding for. And for, you know, full disclosure, there are many years where I was applying for grants, for painting grants, for creating bodies of work, new paintings, but I wasn't getting the grants. And when I turned my attention to drawing, I started to get more grants. So it's interesting. I mean, maybe that's just reflective of what was happening in the art world at the time. But the drawing siphon was a proposed grant project where, you know, is trying to think of something that would be engaging, that would engage an audience, but also engage myself in creating it, that would have some labor-intensive action in it, but doable. And I wanted it to be have a time constraint. So it was a year-long project of drawing at least 6 drawings a day through this tracing mechanism of starting with a figure of a woman in an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and then tracing over that figure over and over again, and changing it ever so slightly each time I drew. So the intent wasn't to create an animation, but when you see the complete work of 2,200 drawings, there is this slight animated effect as it moves from figure to figure. And so this mechanism is like, it's a metaphor for cloning, and the idea that you can't make an exact copy of the original because you can't share experience from that original being. And if you look at these drawings, they change dramatically over time. So there's many, many, many iterations of that original figure, but in the end, there's 2,200 separate beings. But if you look at it as the slideshow, it becomes one being, but with all these different experiences ascribed to each one. It was a really motivating project to work on. I could have just kept going for years doing those drawings, because you can imagine it was very doable in an 8.5 by 11. Of course, there were some days I might not do 6. There were some days I would do more than 6. Yeah, very satisfying to definitely have the time constraint, and yeah, and just create these characters in the end that were related but not related, and yeah, and it relates on a science fiction tip to the Chimera's Daughters, which are also in the show, and which was another drawing related grant, you know, that the Chimera's Daughters is inspired by, well, the proposal was to research Japanese manga and specific genres that have transgressive images of kids and women's bodies, which, you know, I had a history of having transgressive images in my work. And I got to travel to Japan to do some research, which in the end was like being a tourist and just enjoying the culture and buying manga. And the world that's encompassed in the Chimera's Daughters is this science fiction post-apocalyptic world peopled by women and non-binary folks, trans folks, intersex folks, and the world is being pummeled by these asteroids, and their bodies are being well, there's different factions that are in war against each other, and their bodies are also being affected by viruses and post-GMO ingestion, and so very violent but beautiful world. And I continued on with that series into a piece that was at what was called MoCA at the time, this show called Darkness Ascends. I did a wall piece for that, which was a continuation of this story of this Chimera's world. And then there was a third show called The Virtuous Rise of the Matriarchy, which was also continued the story. So again, like I said, I'm hoping to bring all these within a graphic novel called Spinbarkeit, which is a medical name. I guess it's a German word for the viscosity of vaginal mucus when a uterus is at its most fertile. So, yeah. Often when I'm working on a series of work, I'll begin with sketching, and there'll be repeated motifs or icons in the work, symbols that I'll draw over and over and over again. And eventually they become anthropomorphized. So for example, I was drawing a lot of, when I referenced doing work that was going into the body and lots of viscera, I was drawing arteries. And eventually the arteries became these walking characters and active within the scenes that they were in. And I've done that with bows, and the loops of the bow become eyes, and I've done it with even with the crystalline shapes within the Chimera's daughters. They take on more meaning than just being sort of a decorative element. Or maybe they began as a decorative element and then took on more force and became this threatening thing, but also, again, with this contrast of being beautiful at the same time. Yeah, that seems to be part of my process, is to kind of latch on to something that has a lot of symbolism to myself. Perhaps there's more universal meanings that could be ascribed to these things, but I tend to reject that kind of reading into symbols because I find, at least in my practice and my creating work, I think it's so personal. It's like trying to interpret dreams, I think, doesn't work, right? So yeah, I mean, to interpret them on a larger scale and a more universal scale, it doesn't hold a lot for me. In my early days of being an emerging artist, I would often get critiqued for making misogynist imagery. And there was one time I wasn't included in a show about censorship because the curators thought that the work would offend feminists. And now I look back at that, I'm like, what? And I would often meet with art directors if I was doing more commercial work, or even like in the fine art world. Folks would say, we really love your work, but could you not include ejaculating phalluses and flaming vaginas, labia? And then, we come to 30 years later or more, and the thing I've been most active in the last 10 years is creating these sex ed books with Cory Silverberg for kids. So it all worked out in the end.